I call this meeting to order, the 56th meeting of the Standing Committee on Finance. Colleagues, we are continuing our discussions today pursuant to Standing Order 1082, our study of tax evasion and offshore bank accounts. We have the pleasure this morning of having as a witness the Honourable Donald Johnston, Privy Councillor and former Cabinet Minister. Mr. Johnston, thank you so much for being with us here this morning. We did hear from someone from the OECD on Tuesday, Mr. Owens, as well as two other witnesses, two academics regarding this study. This study will continue for some time, but we were very much interested in your perspective on this issue, and then we will have questions from all members. I understand you have some introductory remarks you'd like to make to the committee prior to questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and it's a pleasure to be here. I can't say there are too many of my old colleagues around, but that's not surprising since I last sat in the House in 1988. But I welcome this opportunity because I think, first of all, I regard this as a very important committee, I always have. And secondly, the issue of harmful tax competition and the use of offshore tax havens has grown steadily in importance over the last few decades. I went to the OECD in 1996 as Secretary General, and it was at that time, effectively, that the G7, I think it was still the G7, became concerned, as the OECD had been for some time, about the illegal use of tax havens. You can have legal uses of tax havens, as you all know. There's nothing wrong with having an offshore bank account, provided it's declared, transparent. But of course, over the ensuing period, we came to understand that there was a great deal of money that had been filtered into tax havens who were not cooperative in terms of either transparency or exchange of information and hiding behind bank secrecy. But really, I was surprised myself at how little action we were getting out of governments at that time, including the United States government, including the IRS, including the Treasury, with whom I met on several occasions, because there were some opponents to the OECD. I should tell you that the OECD began the program with a misnomer, calling it harmful tax competition, which was the language actually used in the, as I recall at least, in the resume or the from the G8, which I think was still G7, but was at the Lyon summit, as I recall, and they used the term harmful tax practices. Well, of course, that opened the door to those who like to charge the OECD as being a European-controlled organization where people like to pay a lot of tax and where the social contract is financed with taxpayers' dollars at exorbitant rates. And the OECD, when it refers to tax competition, is really saying everybody should pay the same tax. Well, of course, nothing could be further from the truth. I don't know if Jeffrey Owens testified on this point or not, but the OECD, from an economic point of view, had regarded competitive tax rates as very healthy, can be very efficient. So the notion of competition in tax, which backfired in terms of the initial communications on this program, were corrected in 2000, and it became essentially harmful tax practices. But the opponents of the OECD work continued, of course, to harp on the theme that it was really a European-dominated organization with a totally different view of the relationship between the individual and the state and the social contract, and that the OECD was set on creating uniformity in taxation all over the world. Some of the most outspoken critics were the United States. The Heritage Foundation, as I recall, led by a chap at that time, that part of it on tax by a man called Dan Mitchell, frequently published in newspapers in the United States attacks on the OECD, to the point where I had to go to Washington to meet with senatorial staff and senators to explain the program, some of them threatening to cut off funding to the OECD, which of course would have buried the OECD since the United States contributes 25% of the budget. And that's changed somewhat, but not very much. But at that time, it was a statutory obligation that they paid in the OECD. They paid 25%, even under the formula of contributions, it would have been much more because of the size of the economy. On the other hand, we had strong support from some senators, such as Senator John McCain and others, who realized how important this work was. And similarly, in most of the treasuries around the world, they realized how important this work was. Now, in the last few years, in fact, almost since my departure, there has been an acceleration of activity in the area. And I expect, since you heard from Jeffrey Owens, that he explained to you how the Global Tax Forum, which we created in the year 2000, has grown in significance and grown in, if you like, structure. At that time, it was more of an informal gathering. We had numerous meetings, some of which I attended. But since then, as I understand it, it's become much more effective. It's got many more members. And the OECD, with pressure from the G20, has been successful in bringing more and more countries into the, if you like, the transparency and exchange of information orbit. So that now there are actually no blacklists. We had blacklists at that time of uncooperative jurisdictions, but my understanding is that those blacklists have now been eliminated. Now, that does not mean that all countries are now conforming to the tax information and exchange agreements that they've signed or committed to, but they've made the commitments. And now it's up to peer pressure and review by the committees that are set up under the auspices of the OECD to ensure that there is compliance and ultimately that they adhere to these obligations which they've undertaken. Now, I have to say that I can't help but believe, I should say, that whistleblowing has not played a rather significant role in this. As you know, there have been at least 3 instances of whistleblowing. There have also been evidence of some major Swiss banks which have been involved with, if you like, tax evasion exercises in the United States, and I suppose Canada and other countries. And most recently, there was a chap from HSBC Private Banking in Geneva, where it takes $500,000 just to open an account, who went to France, you probably know this, and gave the French authorities the information which he had on his computer, which involved some 15,000 accounts, a fair number of which I might say were Canadian, about 10% as I recall. A very large number were French, about 7,000, I think the number was, something in that neighborhood. And of course, when you take out your pencil and do a bit of multiplication, you begin to realize you're talking about big money. And this is only one bank. We're not talking about the other issues with respect to UBS, which you've read about, and others, and other jurisdictions. So suddenly, governments, I think, said, now, wait a minute. In this period, when we're all running deficits and we're, fighting for every tax dollar, we have to basically come to grips with this problem. And for me, it's so fundamental, because what's happening is that you around this table and I and others are paying those people's taxes, which should be paid here in Canada. So that's the few introductory remarks, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make. I'm very pleased with the way this program has evolved, and I'm very pleased that the OECD has continued to play such a significant role. And in fact, I think this is why the OECD is now at the G20 meetings, because suddenly this has become a major issue for all our treasuries. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson, for your opening statement. We'll start members' questions with Mr. Szabo for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, and welcome, Mr. Johnston. Your experience in the OECD is very useful. And I think I'd like to start off by asking you maybe an open question about if you believe that the OECD has the will and has in fact taken necessary steps to determine what some would call best practices in dealing with this kind of problem.
You ask me what the OECD has done that?
In your experience, is this body the body that is has the best international interests?
Oh, absolutely. I have my experience at the OECD, not just on tax issues, but as you know, we cover the full range of public policy outside of defense, maybe culture, but we have 150 committees, effectively, and working groups. And they all, of course, are usually manned. Well, they are with delegates from capitals, and they're supported also by the Business Industry Advisory Council and the Trade Union Council. All of them are engaged, so that when there is an OECD proposal, it is usually nonpartisan, objective, and has, I think, made huge progress on many structural issues in particular throughout the membership and beyond, because there are many countries who also now are much engaged with the OECD. When I was there, we got it up to about 70 non-OECD members, including China, India, Russia, Brazil, and all of them draw upon the best practices of the OECD, because these are really the world standards.
I have, having listened to the witness from the OECD, was a little concerned that there seemed to be a gap in terms of the completion of the commitment to dealing with the problem by the virtue of the fact that so many agreements, tax information sharing agreements and other agreements to address, have never been ratified or at various stages of ratification. There doesn't seem to be this aggressive commitment to dealing with what you call big bucks.
Well, I think that's a challenge, of course, for any OECD instrument that requires ratification. You know, if you're just dealing with conventions and best practices, you don't need ratification. You don't have to come before these committees and so on. But where you do, the parliamentary procedures in all jurisdictions, of course, will slow down that process because it comes not just soft law, as most of the OECD work is. But you're quite right. I mean, for example, the convention which we adopted to fight corruption back in 1997, I guess the bribery of foreign public officials, it actually came into being when Canada ratified it, because Canada took a certain critical mass. I can't remember the number, 14, 15, or whatever. But then it continued, you know, over the years to be ratified at different times by different countries, because that's unfortunately the nature of our processes. But I think here the pressure will come from the G20 and the review mechanisms which are in place, where the compliance with the undertakings will be audited, I think, regardless of whether the agreements have been ratified by Parliament. Now, I could be wrong on that, but I think that will be the case, that when the government has signed a a taxation and information exchange agreement, what's called the TAs or whatever they are, I think when that happens, then they will go on the list, and that list is usually published of when those particular countries will be examined by an independent team.
Mm-hmm. There was an example given of the UK's efforts to address this in part, and I stand to be correct on the numbers, but it was something like 4 billion euros invested, yielded 100 billion in return and recovery. Given the magnitude of that example, or our general knowledge of the magnitude of the problem, how does that stack up against other significant priorities of OECD countries?
That's a bit difficult for me to judge. I mean, it's going to be different from country to country. When I was Secretary of the Treasury Board here, we always had that argument from the tax department that if we had more inspectors, we would increase exponentially the amount of revenue that could be recovered. That's always an argument of the revenue officials, and there's obviously some truth in it, but there's also a point of diminishing returns. Now, in the case of what we're looking at here, I think you'll find, I don't have the numbers, but I think you'll find that the voluntary disclosure mechanisms which countries have introduced have been quite effective. I was looking at some of the numbers in the United States, and I've heard some in Canada, and I expect it's true right around the system. I think that's where most of the money will be recouped, even in the absence of signing agreements.
Canada has international trade agreements with 80 to 90 countries around the world, and we don't seem to have tax information sharing agreements attached to those, and so that we can cooperate on the trade and economic activity side. But those kind of things, there are, in terms of tax information sharing or other agreements to cooperate on tax evasion, don't seem to be linked to those trade deals directly. They may be side deals in some cases, but normally it would be a separate deal totally. In your experience, would good faith between countries mean that tax information sharing agreements should be part of them?
Well, if we had that good faith, historically, we wouldn't be having the debates we're having today and the activity within the OECD. I mean, there's been many countries which have not been cooperative. And now with the double taxation conventions, which they use the acronym DTC, I think it's Article 26 or whatever it is, which incorporates, these obligations of exchange of information. And if they're complied with, then I think we've come a long way to solving that problem, independent of the fact that there's nothing in, say, in the trade agreements or in the investment agreements per se. But the double taxation convention agreements, which are probably in effect with most of the countries that you refer to, would have that mechanism.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Szabo. Monsieur Payet, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Payet, please. Thank you. Welcome back to Parliament. I'd like to continue in that line. You say that we have tax information exchange agreements. There are taxation agreements among countries based on good faith. But someone who intends to evade paying taxes has all kinds of skills and qualities except good faith. Are we not in front of a situation, a global situation, where you have corporations that use tax havens legally, but increasingly in a non-ethical and illegitimate manner? And there are also individuals that make illegal use of these bank secrecy standards, and both corporations and individuals are not necessarily ordinary citizens with little means. These are generally the wealthiest people and corporations who, within their organizational chart, have tax experts, lawyers. And we're not talking about small and medium enterprises in Hochelaga riding that are able to use tax havens. We're talking about major corporations here. You are no longer at the OECD. You've have the power to, I'd say, speak freely. And do you not believe that corporations have everything but good faith, and governments are saying that, well, this will all be based on good faith? And you raised the American example earlier. I understand that was at the end of the 1990s. But when the Americans, who are responsible for 25% of the budget, say, well, let's not go too fast here, it could hurt our businesses which are lobbying the government. So we have all these people who are talking about practices globally, and yet we have these corporate bums who are taking advantage of the system.
Mais dans une certaine mesure, évidemment, vous avez raison.
In a certain sense, you're quite right. As I explained, we wouldn't be in the current situation, and we're trying to do an in-depth study of how we can resolve the issues. It doesn't mean we should eliminate all the activities of these corporations that use tax havens and insurance companies as well. What we need is transparency and bank secrecy, and the bank secrecy to which you've referred to. If each governmental authorities have access to these banking information, we could change legislation effectively and the rules of the game. And this is what we've always tried to do. I myself was a tax expert, And when corporations used Bermuda, it was always done in a transparent way. And we introduced the FAPI rules, the foreign approval rules, and corporations would accumulate wealth offshore and simply invested their dividends without any operations. So we have to ensure transparency. The government has to decide, well, you as committee members will have to make recommendations as to how to maximize opportunities for those corporations, but at the same time eliminating abuse. So we have to find a balance. And what we're trying to do is, you speak of good faith. But you need more than good faith, and that's why there are audits carried out, and we'll put pressure on those corporations that are not compliant with domestic laws, because there are no international laws governing this. Canadian domestic laws have to apply, and it is up to you and to tax officials here to apply them correctly. Do you not get the impression that, well, there's a price cost benefit analysis. There are so many public servants, and perhaps if we hire more auditors at the Canada Revenue Agency, well, then there's an easy cost benefit analysis to be done. A public servant can bring in $150 million, for instance, so it's quite profitable. Do you not find that the idea of a voluntary disclosure, that if an individual corporation engages in a voluntary disclosure, that they in fact will be pardoned, because they might say that, oh, they've made an investment, I did not declare it, but then they'll voluntarily disclose it without there being any litigation following. Is that not too easy for the fraudsters? Well, that's a question for parliamentarians to answer. There's the argument out there that voluntary disclosures will accelerate and increase revenue. At the same time, there's the expression that we know, name and shame, but all this has to be confidential. And this is probably something you talked about with Mr. Owens. But one of the important elements of this procedure is to keep all this information confidential. So it is true that there are people out there committing fraud, but I don't know what Canadian authorities are telling those people. I believe they must pay penalties and on dividends and assets. And so they simply cannot say, well, this is what I should have paid, and I don't think they can get away that easily, but I myself don't have all the information as to what is being done in terms of process in Canada. Thank you.
I want to thank our guest for being here today, Mr. Johnson. I mentioned to Mr. Johnson at the beginning of the meeting that he's written a book, Up the Hill, Up on the Hill. I can't remember what the title is, but I read it a number of years ago and talks about life on the Hill. It's a very good read, and I recommend it to anyone, and you can compare it to what's happening today. What are you doing now, Mr. Johnson? When did you leave the OECD, and what are you doing now?
Well, I'm doing really several, if you like, NGO-type activities, but professionally, I'm a consultant to a foundation in Geneva, which is focused on education, health, and the environment, with the primary focus on Africa at the moment, Liberia in particular. That's about half of my time. The other half of my time, I'm back as counsel to the law firm of which I was a founder in 1973, which was called Johnston, Heenan, Blakey, but is now Heenan Blakey.
Okay.
And I'm back there, and it's got offices across Canada.
Thank you. So, in your previous experience at OECD, I believe, and I think in your opening statement today, you're trying to make the differentiate between tax evasion and tax avoidance, where tax evasion would be illegally not paying taxes you're required to, and tax avoidance would be, proper tax planning to take advantage of the tax system to pay as little tax as possible without breaking the law. Would that be was that your view now? Was that the view at the OECD? Did that evolve while you were there? What's your position on that statement you made in the past?
Well, the attitude of the legislatures and the courts has evolved somewhat from the days of the Duke of Westminster case, which you may recall, where that was an example of tax, which was the classic case of tax avoidance. I don't know if any of you are tax specialists here, but then we began into this role. What was the intention? And so, there's much more now, much more discretion given to tax authorities than in the past. But tax avoidance, if you contribute to an RRSP, that's a form of tax avoidance. Right. Had you not done it, you'd pay tax on that money. When you rearrange your investments so you can deduct your interest, that's tax avoidance. All of these issues are tax avoidance and quite legitimate. Some, in fact, like RRSPs, are encouraged by the legislation. Others, when they become too abusive, for example, I started the film tax shelters in Canada back in the late 1960s, and we produced some very good pictures, but that became brought by the authorities some of them. So they kept narrowing and changing and so on to make sure that there was not tax abuse going on in that sector, and that's the way the law should operate, basically. And so the distinction is still, I think, quite legitimate between avoidance and evasion, evasion being fraud, not reading.
Right. Another topic which you've been quoted in speaking on is about transparency. And I believe your view, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or not, is that what's important for governments around the world is that we communicate with those other governments, and that the information about individuals or corporations that happen to be doing business or having accounts in that area, that transparency is the key to success in terms of being able to track down that money that someone is using those systems for tax evasion. And we've been active in signing TIAs, or information exchanges. We have, I think, 11 signed, 14 on the go, something like that. We're in that range. What's your view of the role of the TIAs that now exist, and do you see any, from your experience, anything that we should be doing to either improve that system or be more active, or do you have any opinion on that, on TIAs?
Well, I think that you should be active on it. I think the important thing is to bring that process to a satisfactory conclusion. There will always be tax evasion. There's no question about that. There will always be fraud. There will always be bank robbers. But the fact is that the progress that's been made, I would say, over the last 5 years, from what I read and in my discussions with OECD officials, is really quite remarkable. And I think it's been inspired by the fact that suddenly people realize we're talking not just money at the margins, but we're talking billions and billions and billions of taxpayers' dollars. And some of it, of course, it also plays into corruption. And we have another organization which we created called the Financial Action Task Force, which is basically trying to identify money laundering, which could be from the drug trade, gambling, trading in humans, and all this sort of illegal, counterfeit goods. All of this is getting, I think, better and better, but we've still got a long way to go. So I think the role for Canada is to continue to be very active at the OECD and in other fora, although I have a bias towards the work at the OECD, and especially the committee which is supported by Jeffrey Owens. And I'll tell you why, because I mentioned all the committees we have, but the Committee on Fiscal Affairs was manned by decision makers at the bureaucratic level. People who could actually go back and make the difference. We had Reid McCloskey, who was head of the CRA, who actually changed it. He actually didn't change it. He actually chaired it. We had Joe Guttentag, which was one of the most senior in the Treasury of the United States. Frank Gabbs McClue from the Treasury in the UK. And these people were basically operating back in capitals at the decision-making level in terms of making recommendations directly to the ministers and the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. In fact, you would meet them all together. Rubin and Guttentag and others, would be there. These were the meetings that you would have. Same thing in the UK. And that's why that committee is so important. That committee is important because it'll get things done. It will just be, you know, somebody going back and making a report which gradually filters up through the bureaucracy on a particular subject. So I lay great emphasis on the role that that committee is playing and the role it has played. And I think the results have been very effective.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. We'll go to Ms. Hughes for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, and I'd like to give the regrets of my colleague Thomas Mulcair. He was really hoping to be here today, and unfortunately he wasn't able to be. Just some of the comments, and there's been, you know, certainly a lot of hype on this, and rightly so. There's been basically, you know, we've seen Canadians and corporations invest over $80 billion just in the Cayman Islands, Barbados, and Bermuda. And my question at this point is, there's been a lot of trade agreements, free trade agreements, that this government has actually been pushing through, and certainly there's some confusion or some questions as to whether or not we should actually be signing trade agreements with countries who turn a blind eye to basically this type of tax evasion. So I'm just wondering, you know, your comments on that, is whether or not, because to me we should actually be ensuring that when we are looking at trade agreements, not only should they be fair, but secondly is that we shouldn't be signing something with a country who is not going to abide by the rules that we want to put in place to make Canada a better place to live, really. So I'm just wondering your comments on that.
Well, the question is a bit difficult because you know, you have to have trade agreements. I'm a great believer in multilateral trade agreements as opposed to RTAs, as they're called, bilateral trade agreements. But the latter have become necessary because of the failure and slowdown to complete the Doha round of negotiations on trade. But if you, for example, have a major trading partner, and that major trading partner is encouraged to make its best efforts, for example, to clean up its corruption and tax and human rights or whatever else you wish to add, the ILO rules and so on. Some of that is incorporated into the trade agreements today. I mean, because we're venturing a bit afield here, because we have the multinational enterprise guidelines as well, the OECD, which are being more and more incorporated into trade agreements, which essentially requires corporations to behave as good citizens in whatever country they are operating. And that's whether it's a Canadian company or, you know, an American company or whatever. And there's a system of sanctions and reporting, again, looking for transparency in their activities in these countries. But I think you have to be very cautious about mixing the two, and, you know, to a great extent, because, I mean, we know there's a lot of corruption, for example, in some of the major economies of the world. Now, are you going to not sign a trade agreement with them because of that? I mean, that's a judgment that the government has to make. And so I would not be in a position to second-guess what the government would do. But you have to be realistic about these issues. And I think the way you get at a lot of this, that's why I'm so keen on the OECD getting Russia at the table. Russia has a lot of internal problems. I'd like to see it. I tried to get Russia into the OECD, because when the Russia's at the OECD, sitting at the table like this with the other countries around the table, and people are pointing their fingers at it and saying, now listen, this is what's happening in your country. That's how you get things changed. You get things changed by engaging them rather than isolating them. So I'm not very enthusiastic personally about isolating countries or saying we're not going to do trade with you. I'd rather have them at the table and be able to constructively criticize, you know, their domestic policies, and that's what the OECD is very good at.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your frankness on this, and I think that I still have some concern with respect to the fact that we would actually sign agreement. For example, you know, the trade agreement that was signed with Colombia, that's being signed with Colombia, and you know, these are countries and that are very well known for their human rights abuse, and nothing so far has assisted in ensuring that that won't happen. So that's where my concerns come about with respect to that as well. Is, you know, we know that there's corruptions. There's corruptions within their governments, and it's very difficult to try to swallow. The other thing that I've got on here is, you know, and you talked about, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit more with respect to what we should maybe be doing more to address the issue of tax evasion. And I think that, you know, you certainly touched on a few things. Something that we see being planned right now is some reductions in the CRA, and these are some of the areas where they do the investigation with respect to tax evasion. So I'm just wondering, you know, your view, and again, I know that you're not the government of the day, and, you know, I'm just wondering, with your view, you know, does that make sense that we would be reducing in the area where we're looking to take back those dollars, or find those dollars that are being hidden?
Well, those are questions for the, you know, probably for the Treasury Board to address, as I did when I was there. In other words, what is the optimum number of employees you need in a particular area of activity, you know, without prejudicing that activity? And perhaps there are other ways of addressing the same problem, you know, with less human power, if you like. So it's very, very difficult to judge. I mean, with all the technologies which we've introduced, and the communication technology and ITC that exists today, which didn't exist in my day, I would have thought that one could look to a lot of reductions and efficiencies and you know, good exchange of information with fewer people. But I don't know what the CRA is, you know, is proposing to reduce. I just have no idea.
But normally, when you are investigating, especially at something, when we're looking at this amount of money, I mean, we're talking billions of dollars here.
Okay. Just a brief response, Mr. Johnson.
Well, I mean, we don't know how much money. That's one of the big questions, isn't it? I don't think anybody knows how much money we're talking about, but we're beginning to suspect that it's very substantial. And how much is being recovered out of the total mass through voluntary disclosure, I don't know if anybody has a handle on that either. You may have asked Jeffrey Owens that question, but from what I know, I don't think that anybody can really tell. But most of us have been surprised at the amount as we've seen so far.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hughes. We'll go to Mr. Bryson, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to see you here today, Mr. Johnston, and welcome back. And your work at the OECD was very important in terms of shaping the agenda and the importance of the OECD. And the OECD continues to provide a lot of good public policy ideas and input and guidance to public policy makers in governments here and around the world. So, question: during your time, you would have the international mechanism that would have been most likely to look at this kind of issue would have been the G7. It would have been one of the bodies at the time. Today, with the G20 and the G20 having emerged as probably the most powerful for economic and financial reform post-crisis, do you believe the G20 could play an important role in terms of this issue on international tax measures and governance?
Well, I think the G20 might. I think judgments of that are still out in a sense, because it has obviously a very significant role, because it brings all the big players together. Whether it can effectively play the role has yet to be seen. The G7, in my experience, actually didn't really do much. It basically mandated others to do things, like the OECD, and that's what the G20 is saying. They're saying, we want you to go further with your work on harmful tax practices. or we want to set up, this financial action task force in the OECD to cover money laundering, or we want to change some of the procedures with respect to foreign aid, and so on and so forth. So you don't expect the G7, nor do I expect the G20 to actually have a very active kind of secretariat like the OECD, which is kind of becoming a secretariat in a lot of these issues. So the actual mechanisms of getting it done should come from there, but the political will has to come from the G20.
In some ways, G20, say G20 finance ministers, does the G20 not represent a more binding authority in some ways than the OECD on this kind of matter?
Well, when you say binding, in what sense? I mean,
the capacity to actually bring in a protocol and enforce it in each country. The OECD has developed more into a public policy generator and advocate in some ways in recent years. And is the G20 not more of a practical binding authority in terms of imposing on governments a common approach on issues like this?
I haven't been at any of the G20 finance. I was at some of the earlier ones, but I haven't been at the G20 summits. But I don't know how that could be the case. The G7 was not the case. What additional mechanisms have been introduced to the G20 that would differ from the G8, for example? I'm not aware of that. In other words,
I think the crisis has created a bit of a role for the G20 that wasn't probably as strong in the past. I think that the financial crisis, we've seen during the financial crisis a greater commonality of purpose. And my understanding is, and in fact, realistically, the G20 has played a greater role post-crisis than the G7 played during its period.
Well, I just don't know. I mean, we have bodies that execute. For example, at the G20 meetings, you have the OECD, you have the World Bank, you have the IMF, you have the Financial Stability Forum,
But there's a difference between bodies that can advocate policy and ones where finance ministers sit down and make accords and say, we're going to do this together. And I think that I think there would be a general consensus that the G20 has emerged as a powerful vehicle. So in order to actually effect legislative change in individual countries that would create a consistent approach to issues like this in terms of international tax protocol, for instance.
Well, it would be good if that were the case, but I haven't seen it yet. I mean, countries have taken for example, the financial crisis, countries have taken quite different views with respect to stimulus programs as opposed to tax cuts, as opposed to so on. And they're all there.
On that, I would argue, though, there's probably never been a more coordinated approach to a national challenge.
We'll come back to that in the next Liberal round. Thank you.
Geneva or something.
Okay. We look forward to that. Okay, order. Monsieur Carrier, s'il vous plaît, pour 5 minutes.
Mr. Carrier, you have 5 minutes. Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Johnston. I am not a financial expert. I am an MP of a riding and concerned of the welfare of my constituents. The information I'd like to hear from you is, well, for instance, last Tuesday we heard from a researcher, Mr. Alain Deneau, who told us that Canada was considered as an ally of tax havens. And that's an impression that comes from outside the parliamentary world. Canada is seen as what? As an ally. An ally is walking hand in hand with tax havens in order to encourage tax evasion. And at the same time, he told us that the government of Quebec lost approximately 5% of its income through tax evasion. We also heard from Ms. Brigitte Alpin, who's a chartered accountant specializing in those fiscal areas, and assessed that in 2009 there were $146 billion Canadian in tax havens. Personally, I find that all quite discouraging. And I'm wondering whether you agree with that perception that we are considered to be an ally of those tax haven jurisdictions, or is that a false impression? I'd like to hear you about that. As a Canadian taxpayer, I don't have the impression that I'm living in a tax haven. No, that Canada's an ally. Well, you're saying that we're allied with those tax havens. Well, there are a number of things. Now, for instance, where did she come up with those numbers, that $146 billion figure that's hidden away in tax haven? Where does that estimate come from? Where does that 5% lost income come from in terms of lost revenue in Quebec? You know, people who come up with statistics like that must be able to justify them. And it's impossible to do so. How can she know how much money, how much Canadian money is located in Andorra, for instance? So I can't comment on that, but I don't really have the impression that Canada encourages tax havens. No. Well, for example, since time is short here, the 5 Canadian chartered banks in their annual reports show the amounts that are invested in tax havens. Those amounts total $1.3 billion. And that is $1.3 billion in lost tax revenue from the 5 chartered banks. And so that is an official statistics. Of course, as you said, we don't know the overall situation, but banks themselves in their annual reports have evaluated that there was $1.3 billion in unpaid taxes. Money that they made in branches located in tax havens. So that is a direct encouragement to our financial institutions in tax havens. And last Tuesday, Ms. Alpin said that to act with regard to tax havens, you need to have international agreements. It's hard to act unilaterally. So my question to you is whether our hands are bound, and how come Canada can't act to improve the situation in order to reduce the level of investments in tax havens? Well, I imagine that the investments you speak of, the lost income which you refer to, are revenue from operations outside the country, no doubt. Banks have branches in the Guernsey, in Jersey Islands, in other locations. So the money there is generated by operations that are not Canadian. So those are operations carried out outside of Canada. If Canada wants to choose, wants to change the regulations with regard to revenues from operations that are not commercial, those are taxable here. But if a bank does business in Africa, for instance, and makes profits in Africa, should Canada tax those profits made there? I don't think so. But, of course, it's up to you to decide and to make recommendations in that regard. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Carrier.
And I appreciate your presentation today. Certainly brings much expertise to the table. And I think I first of all want to pick up on 2 comments, and perhaps it's as much a comment as a question. We talked about the sort of capacity of CRA, and I think Madame Hughes or Ms. Hughes indicated that we had less people on the job. You talked about there's certainly money out there. There's diminishing returns as you increase, and also there's opportunities with new technology. But I think for the record, the CRA's aggressive tax planning program has doubled, and the number of full-time employees working on international audits is up 44%. And an additional $30 million has been allocated to combat international tax planning. So last year we did actually retrieve $1 billion in unpaid taxes. So I really appreciate where you commented in terms of we need to achieve that balance in terms of, yes, perhaps more resources, but where is that right balance? And hopefully we are working towards making sure we do achieve that. I don't know if you have any comments there, but the other comment that I really want to pick up on also is Mr. Owens indicated, he just said, we know the number is big, we know we just need to deal with it and go after it rather than sort of focusing on a lot of quantification. Our colleague from the block suggested that it's quantified. Could you talk again about that, the challenges of quantifying, and do you perhaps sort of share that perspective of Mr. Owens that it's out there, it's big, and we need to proceed?
Well, I can't really add much to what Mr. Owens says, because I don't have any personal knowledge of it. I mean, I've followed actually the activities of this particular committee quite closely because I felt that taxation is so fundamental in so many areas, and I've been engaged in it myself historically. But, how can we tell how much money, like these numbers we're hearing here, are out in those tax havens? We don't know, when the whole purpose of Jeffrey Owens' work is to create these taxation information and exchange agreements that the G20, which Mr. Brisson has told us how significant. I think the pressure from the G20 is very significant in ensuring that these other jurisdictions who are so dependent upon the G20, I mean, Switzerland was very difficult, for example. Switzerland has moved a long way in the last few years. Now, why is that? Well, it's because Switzerland has a lot of interests other than just the banking sector and other than just bank secrecy and so on. So, I mean, it's gradually, it's because of the pressure from European countries, the United States and Canada and others, that these countries will come around. And that's what's got to happen. The pressure's got to come, must come from outside, and it's happening. But as Mr. Owens probably told you, it's not complete yet. I mean, everyone's off the blacklist, but that doesn't mean that everybody is conforming to the tax information exchange agreements. And that's why there's an audit that goes on. There's a whole series of criteria that are applied to determine whether they are conforming. So I would say that let's give it a couple of years and see how much progress we make. If you collected $1 billion last year, maybe you'll collect another $1 billion this year. I mean, I don't know. But we're talking serious money. We do know that.
So you have indicated that every country now is off the blacklist. It sounds like there's a few countries who, perhaps through lack of monitoring, through lack of will, have not passed some of the phase 1, phase 2 audits. Is that? But there's certainly pressure on them to up their standards. Is that?
Well, that's my understanding. I mean, I'm 4 years out of the OECD, so I've basically just have been following the traffic on it as you have and others. But I have seen that the blacklist is now gone, but that doesn't mean that there are not deficiencies. There are a lot of deficiencies in the report that was put forward, I think, 2 years ago. There were still a lot of they all were off the blacklist, but there were still a lot of countries that are having difficulty conforming with some requirements. For example, in some jurisdictions, it's very hard to tell who owns, who the beneficiaries are of certain bank accounts, trusts, other arrangements of that kind, and that work must continue.
Okay, thank you. We will have time for another round. We'll go to Mr. Pichetti, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Johnson, for coming forward. We had Mr. Owens from the OCD, and I think that Ms. McLeod was sort of asking the question, but correct me if I'm wrong, but when you were part of the OECD, it was more of an exclusive club where you sort of said, we're not going to do business with you because you don't have the same regulatory or rules as we do.
Whereas now, what I'm understanding from Mr. Owens is more of an inclusive. If you want to do business with us, you have to conform to us. Am I understanding that correctly? Has the attitude changed?
Well, I don't know. This goes back to a question I think that Ms. Hughes raised about do you not do business with a country and trade because they're not basically meeting your standards in taxation. Well, I think, the OECD used to be called the rich man's club when I joined it, which was a bit of an exaggeration since Turkey had been a member, since the outset in 1960. And of course, we had other countries coming on. But what has happened is that the OECD's reach has extended enormously in the last 10, 15 years. I mean, it used to be, when I was there were 28 countries, and then I received Poland and Korea and Slovakia, I guess, 27 up to 30. Now there have been more added, but apart from the ones that are added, this global forum, for example, that I expect that Jeffrey Owens spoke about, we created in 2000, there's something like 95 countries involved in it. So we're talking now about, really the large bulk of the world's GDP that's represented, at the forum. And those countries are the ones that are, they're taking on these understandings, these obligations, these agreements, these tax information exchange agreements. So, I think it's, I think if the impression he might have left is that it was a small club initially that was mostly trading amongst itself. Amongst the OECD members, they're about 60 or 70% of GDP. But then, of course, that all changed with China, India, and others coming along. So now, of course, it's a much, much broader base. So that means
in your opinion,
many more countries.
In your opinion, global uniformity is better than exclusivity?
Well, global uniformity in terms of transparency, yes. Not in terms of tax rates, but in terms of...
Why not in terms of tax rate?
Why not?
Yes.
Well, because that goes right to the fundamentals of what each government sees as best for its people and keeping its country in balance. For example, you take a country like Denmark, very, very high tax rates, personal tax rates, but not high corporate tax rates, so it does get a considerable amount of foreign investment. But the other side of that coin is, the Danish minister came to me and said that their tax rates were the same as the United States. And I had this sheet in front of me that showed that they were only second to Sweden. And I said, how do you establish that? Well, he said, look, if you live in the United States, you're a middle-income earner, you want to send your kids to university, you have to pay for it. You want to have health care, you have to pay for it. You add all of that up, and, in Denmark, we pay for it. So at the end of the day, the amount of disposable income left over for what other purposes is the same. And he had a chart to show this. Well, I thought that was very interesting. But I pointed out to him that the American did have a choice. But, that's why I say you can't have uniform tax rates. Every country will have its own, its own particular
And just
approach.
in terms of your experience and with technology, the question I asked the panel this week on Tuesday is the ever-changing technology, is it helping government or is it helping the rule breaker?
I don't know. I I certainly think it's making government more efficient. I mean, here we can, Canada now, you file your tax returns online. I mean, I think it's made a huge difference in terms of.
Okay, and just maybe another quick question in terms of voluntary disclosure. If would it be? You mentioned that it would be quicker if we allow tax evaders to declare their income. But was there ever any analysis made in the past to determine if it's a worthwhile exercise? I know there's some countries in Europe that have sort of charged a flat rate, whether it be 10%, 15, 20, or 25%. And they've gotten good results, but it's sort of been a temporary, like you said, a temporary spike in revenues for the government, and then sort of.
I don't have an answer to that question either. I mean, I think we can all hope that this period we're going through is a transitional period to a point where the amount of funds in these tax havens will be virtually eliminated. And the Italians did it, I think, first. Invited Italians to repatriate capital, a very favorable tax rate from Switzerland, which they did, and it worked. Now, how many didn't and still have it there? Who knows? I mean, so that's the point. I don't think we really know, but I think that if you take a picture in time, we're a lot better off today than we were, say, 20 years ago.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Pichetti. We'll go to Ms. Glover, please.
I too want to welcome you and state that it is an honor to meet you, and we truly appreciate everything you've done in your various roles. Today, in particular, you've made some comments that have really made us think about what we're doing in investigating the tax haven issue. One of the comments that you made was about whistleblowers. And so I'd like to share with you a few of the things that CRA has done to work on this issue, and then get your comment about whistleblowers and about the voluntary disclosure program. So if you'd allow me, one of the things that Canada has done extensive work on is these tax treaties that have been mentioned before. And of course, it was our Minister of Finance who announced in 2007 during the budget that these treaties would now have revisions which must include the new OECD standard for exchange of information, which I think is important, and I think it reiterates some of the comments that you've made. Another thing that the CRA has done is that they now have centres of expertise across Canada with senior audit professionals and specialists in international tax and tax avoidance. And last year, as Ms. McLeod mentioned, the CRA was able to uncover over $1 billion in unpaid federal tax from Canadian taxpayers involved in aggressive international transactions. And then the last thing, which you also touched upon, was that the voluntary disclosure program leads to disclosures, and the CRA received almost 3,000 international voluntary disclosures last year, and it's steadily increased over the past 5 years. And so going back to the whistleblowing and the voluntary disclosure program, can you tell me what your opinion is of the voluntary disclosure program, and if you can just clarify how that works?
Well, I can only give you my opinion. I don't know, the OECD would know, I don't know that every country is dealing with it in exactly the same manner, but I'm told that there's an effort at that committee, at the OECD, the Committee on Fiscal Affairs, to establish, sort of approaches which they all agree upon. The reason I think the whistleblower is important, even though the governments in question, for example, the Swiss authorities are trying to prosecute, I think, this because he broke bank secrecy rules in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. But the importance of it, I think, is a psychological one. I think that many people that might have funds in these offshore jurisdictions, who have always thought that they were, safe and that bank secrecy would protect them, woke up one morning to find that they might be subject to exposure through a whistleblower, and this is in Switzerland in this case, which is a place of high repute, very high banking standards, and so on. So I think that and I say, and this is only my opinion, but I think the fallout from that has probably been very positive in pushing people to make voluntary disclosures. Because they say, if I don't make a voluntary disclosure, maybe a whistleblower will nail me. Maybe I'm on that list. Maybe the authorities already know about me. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think has been important. So I don't know how all the countries are dealing with it. The last one I read, the one about HSBC, I think there was something like 7,000 French names, on that list. And I don't know how the French authorities are dealing with it, but I do know that from the reports that very, very few of those names had actually disclosed their holdings or their income or this income to the French authorities. So I think all of that is, some people are anti-whistleblowing, some are in favor of it, but I do think that if you ask my opinion, I think it's had that effect in this instance.
Okay, very good, thank you. And I appreciate that, because I read the article on the same incident and found it very interesting how it progressed and then how the whistleblower was dealt with at the end. So I appreciate your comments on that. You've indicated that over the last 5 years there's been remarkable progress. Can you tell me what you feel is Canada's most significant action during those 5 years?
Well, I don't look at Canada as being the problem. I mean, I think Canada has been part of the solution by being active on the dossier internationally. And the minister has, again, this supports Mr. Brisson's point. If Minister Flaherty has said that these rules are now going to be incorporated in all these agreements and so on, that maybe that flows out of his discussions at the G20, which is a good thing. So that would be positive, but I think Canada has continued to play, I think, a very significant role at the OECD and in other fora, and that's basically the best thing that Canada can do. I mean, Canada is not, c'est pas le mauvais élève de la classe,
Not the bad student in the classroom.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Glover. We'll go to Mr. Szabo again, please.
Thank you. With regard to the UBS situation, when you look at this Igor Olenikov, who was found to have, in 2006, tax investigators I'm reading here, found that this gentleman had 11,000 houses and a large collection of high-grade offices, but in less than 30 seconds they gave him to make up his mind about whether or not he'd become a whistleblower and let the cards come down. It strikes me as a case where it's in front of your face, and a lot of people are involved, and a lot of people know. And it took years, literally years, to even get to the progress that they made. I wonder why it isn't within in our culture where it's in the best public interest to reasonably address the tax evasion issue, that we cannot see what's in front of our face. And I'm wondering whether or not the jurisdictions within, for instance, the Canada Revenue Agency, they have estimates on underground economy, they have other things, but we very rarely see any progress in terms of breaking down some of these. We cannot be isolated and immune that we don't participate in this stuff. And the example of UBS is an extraordinary one. But there are a lot of people who are culpable and complicit in what's going on. And it includes people within banks, within law firms, within accounting firms, within consulting firms. And yet it seems to be the acquiescence of governments not to be aggressive, and OECD not to be aggressive, seems to be, this is why we haven't dealt with the problem. What's wrong with my hypothesis?
I don't know what's wrong with your hypothesis. I mean, basically, what you're saying, I think, is that there are a lot of tax frauders out there, and that there's a lot of assistance from professionals and banks and so on. That takes us back to the issue of evasion and avoidance to some degree. Because in my experience as a practitioner, I did not see a lot of evasion, in fact, I think that lawyers and others and accountants in, say, large respectable firms will be the first to tell their clients that they better make a voluntary disclosure, for example. I've seen a lot of that recently when the client has confessed that they have these assets offshore. There are also some issues here that I don't know if they bear discussion here, but I think that we have to recognize that there are many countries in the world where, especially Eastern Europe, Russia, and so on, when the Iron Curtain dropped, they had no tradition of paying taxes on a voluntary basis. I mean, it was, I spoke to the Russian tax authorities. I mean, here we grew up with a culture is that, if you have income, the onus is on you to declare it. The onus is not on the government to discover it. If they discover you haven't declared it, then you've got a problem. But basically, our system operates on the basis of us around this table declaring what our income is. Well, there was no tradition of that in the old Soviet Union or in Eastern European countries under communist rules. So that those people had a totally different attitude towards all of a sudden, what is this? This business of taxation. In fact, the Russian authorities told me they didn't even know who the taxpayers could be. They have no, it's an extraordinary situation. We have to rebuild from that base. And of course, that lends itself to probably an enormous amount of tax evasion in those countries. And much of that money might have found its way into jurisdictions like Switzerland, Cyprus, and elsewhere. Canada's in a bit of a different situation. I mean, sure, there's bound to be, levels of tax evasion, underground economy. We all do estimates on that, but by and large, I think our system functions pretty well.
Now, so
30 seconds.
Canada's, good old boys, but the fact remains that with the challenges that we face and the demands for resources, for health care, for pensions, for helping those in most need, continue to fall short. But we're not prepared to go after what we know intuitively must be an extraordinary amount of money. And I'm concerned that what you've basically said now is we're self-assessing as individuals, honor system as it were, and Revenue Canada or CRA is just there to check off what we're prepared to declare, but not prepared to invest in investigation. Why is that?
Oh, well, they do. I mean, they put you subject to audit occasionally. You'll find companies are subject to audit, but I think those questions are best addressed to the CRA, because I'm sure that they would be likely to disagree with you. I mean, they probably would say, no, I think we follow pretty closely these issues. I don't know what they're doing. I presume the committee would like to hear from them about the Canadians on the list, for example, that came out of HSBC. I mean, what actions have they taken? Initially, I read that they weren't doing anything, but I don't think that's the case. I can't imagine that being the case in any of the countries.
Okay.
Those would be good questions to put to them.
Thank you. Thank you. Go to Ms. Block, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I would like to welcome you as well, Mr. Johnston, to our committee this morning. I have really appreciated the testimony that you've given, and I do want to thank the member, Mr. Paillet, for recommending this study to our committee. I think it's been a very interesting study for us to pursue, as it is a very important issue, and one that I believe our government takes quite seriously, as demonstrated by the leadership of Minister Flaherty and the leadership that he has shown in getting G20 members to crack down on tax havens. My colleagues mentioned that Canada has an extensive network of tax treaties, one of the largest in the world, with 87 treaties in force, and it was also mentioned that currently there are 11 signed TIA agreements with 14 under negotiation. And I just want to follow up on a couple of comments made by my colleagues across the way. Mr. Szabo, when he talked about the relationship perhaps between if you have a tax treaty, does it follow that you would have a TIA in place? And then the comments that Ms. Hughes made in regards to free trade agreements and whether or not we should be signing free trade agreements. And I'm just wondering if you would comment perhaps on the relationship that there is between, if any, a free trade agreement, a tax treaty, and what might follow into a TIA.
Well, that's a fairly searching question. I mean, I can't imagine some relationships between trade and tax treaties because of the double taxation mechanisms, that exist, and also the very important issue that we didn't talk about, but transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is another critical contribution of the OECD to basically the revenues of various countries, because if you're a manufacturer, as you know, that any major manufacturer today, the finished product probably is sourced with materials from any number of countries. So the corporation has an business, obviously has a motive to maximize the profit in that transaction realized in the country of lowest tax. Mm-hmm. And that's why the whole transfer, pricing mechanisms are so critical today, and because most international trade is intra-corporation as well. So when you put those two things together, you do see a relationship between, for example, the treatment under taxation treaties or double taxation conventions, the use of transfer pricing mechanisms, and trade. I think that Ms. Hughes' question was a bit different. Should we have it trade agreement with a country with whom we have fundamental disagreements on human rights or drug trade or whatever else. And, you know, that's a question that has bedeviled us for years in Canada, whether it's China or Cuba or whatever. One of the questions I've always asked myself, you know, when I was in politics is, well, will it make a difference if we don't? I mean, in other words, are we better to have it, or if we just say we're not going to deal with you, is that going to change their domestic politics, which is something you have to reflect upon. I know that there have been 2 points of view expressed on that, you know, within our various parties in Canada. I don't think I think it's a cross-party issue. I don't think you can say that this is something that any party has a firm view on, but it's a very, very interesting and tough question to answer. Okay. But on the other, I agree. I think there is a relationship that one can draw to that extent. If you have a trading relationship, it means, if you have a trading agreement, it means you've got trade both ways, hopefully. And therefore, you have to have ensure that each country receives its share of the tax dollar that should be generated by the profits from that trade.
Thank you. I do have another question. Earlier, at the beginning, you talked about bank secrecy. You referenced, you stated what we need is transparency. And I'm wondering if you could comment quickly, in your opinion, how effective are the tax information change agreements in increasing tax transparency and decreasing bank secrecy in tax havens and offshore financial centers?
That you're going to have to, I think, wait for the review process. You know, there's a review process underway because we all know that you can sign any number of agreements. The real issue is compliance, and you know, are the countries living up to the obligations which they undertake? And this is going to be done through these audits, and those audits will also probably draw upon contributions from NGOs and others that are watching, you know, what's going on in these various countries. So I think it's difficult to say. I mean, the groundwork is there, but as you all know, an agreement of any kind, legislation of any kind, is really meaningless until you see how well it's being applied.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Block. We'll go to Ms. Hughes again, please.
I just certainly I appreciate the comments from my colleagues across the way, and Mrs. MacLeod indicated with respect to, you know, that it's important to find a balance, and I think that this is exactly the point that I was actually making a while ago. It was about finding a balance on whether or not you should be removing investigators that are actually making a difference. And let's just look in 2008, 2009, there was $7.4 billion that was actually recovered. And I think that that's an excellent return for the investment that we have in having investigators there. And so it's evident that investigations so far indicate that, and as you've mentioned as well, that the loss of taxes to Canada is extremely substantial. And that's what you indicated, that, you know, you can only estimate that it's actually extremely substantial. And based on the amount of money that these investigators did find in 2008, 2009, it's very evident. And at the end of the day, it's really the honest taxpayers who are being shortchanged. This loss of revenue impacts on the government's ability to provide public services such as healthcare, education, job creation. For every dollar not collected, it actually means that a dollar that someone else has to pay or a dollar that has to come out of the programming of the public services. So my question, in the United States, they actually publish where the revenues are lost each year. And they've indicated at one point there was $100 billion in revenues that was lost. So, and this is to tax havens. So I'm just wondering, do you think that this is a good practice, an effective way to ensure that government is actually transparent?
I'm sorry, which part of that? You mean the publication of?
Yes.
Well, but they don't. They just published a gross number that they thought was lost in tax havens, I guess. I don't know how. I mean, I don't know how that contributes to government transparency. Transparency may sound like a bit of a well-worn phrase, but I happen to believe that it's the most important single thing in government. In fact, in everything. I mean, it's and certainly in tax matters. So, the more information that's out there for the public, the better. And the public, you made a point which I think is a very important one. Those people that are basically shortchanging the revenue authorities here, out of illegally, in other words, fraudulent dollars, are basically taking money out of your pocket. And it's either coming out of the programs you said, the programs that you want to finance are either shortchanged, or the taxes are too high to finance the programs because they'd be supplemented by this income. And in the past, that's why I said earlier, I think that everyone thought it was so marginal it didn't really matter very much, but maybe it matters a lot when you start looking at these numbers. These are substantial numbers they're talking about. So it's, to me, reprehensible that these people should be, that I should be paying their taxes, basically. Or you should be paying their taxes. Well, we're all paying their taxes. I don't want to pick on the two of us, but...
Well, I think the impact is even greater when it comes to the dollars that are actually be taking out of some of the services that are actually being provided, and I think that because we know that that actually affects the most marginalized people in the society. So our point of view is certainly we need to ensure that there is a better process put in place, that there's transparency, and that we look at enforcement and tougher regulations. So I just want to go back to a couple of comments that you've made with respect to, you talked about a review process, you talked about a financial task force. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate basically the review process, the terms of that and the timelines, and then the financial task force, if you could elaborate as well as to, I guess, kind of their mandate and basically the entity of it. I just want a little bit more information on that. Thanks.
Well, on the latter part, I can't really comment on the audit process except that it exists. I mean, the OECD, I think, has probably published the reviews that are going to take place. They have a 30-man, I think, committee and broken down into various groups which are responsible for conducting these reviews, of the TIs, or the Transparency and Exchange, Transparency, Taxation Information Exchange Agreements is what they are. And are they being adopted? Are they being enforced? And so on. And there will be a report made to the G20 on that. So that's the first part of your question. On the financial task force that you refer to, I, in passing, mentioned the Financial Action Task Force, if that's what you're referring to, which was created also, I think, at the Leo Summit, and it was stabled at the OECD. But it was like CSIS. It was kind of a black box because it was essentially working with the police authorities and others on money laundering. The whole idea was to try and get banks and others, and there are also audits done by it, going in and saying, do you know your customers and where did that money come from, and try to work their way back up the chain to find whether it was, illegal money that was being transferred into some of our financial institutions, and also that it was being, using fences to get it out in the public. I mean, but we never really had any detailed information from them because they regarded their work as very secret.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hughes. We'll go to Ms. Bryson again, please.
Again, Mr. Johnston. Our trade agreements today include strong provisions on labor rights and environmental responsibility. Should we be fortifying areas around transparency, either in the main bodies or through side agreements? And are there examples of trade agreements that have included these measures that you can point to?
I really can't respond to that in terms of transparency. I'm not sure how you would work that into the trade agreements. I mean,
if you could work, and currently countries do include chapters on labor rights and chapters on environmental responsibility that are actually quite robust in terms of punitive measures if either of the two countries fail to meet the agreed upon standards. And if countries can can include in their trade agreements measures on the environment or on labor rights, I would posit that they ought to be able to do the same with measures on transparency, particularly around transparency around tax measures, as an example.
Well, I would imagine, though, Mr. Bryson, that I would imagine, I don't know because I don't purport to have expertise in this area, but I would imagine that nearly all the countries with whom you negotiate trade agreements, you also have taxation conventions with.
Yeah.
So that is the complementarity. I mentioned earlier the issue of, for example, transfer pricing and that exchange of information in Article 26 of your conventions should cover that point, I think. But again, it'd be best to have someone in here from trade or from revenue to talk to that. But I would have thought that they would regard those two as being complementary packages.
I believe when you were at the OECD led the charge with the MAI, the Multilateral Agreement on Investments, and it was could a vehicle like the Multilateral Agreement on Investment help achieve greater transparency and help provide additional tools to fight, for instance, inappropriate tax measures or actions or evasion. It strikes me that I believe the New Democrats and perhaps some of their sister parties in other countries played a role in opposing the MAI, but would the MAI have potentially helped strengthen government's multilateral capacity to act on this issue?
Well, I think so. The work done leading up to the failure of the MAI, I think became a very substantial and important piece of work in terms of the investment provisions which have been introduced elsewhere and which have been working, through the WTO and so on. So again, I mean, all of these, I think, are very important instruments, I think you have investment provisions in the FTAs and in NAFTA, and so on. I don't know the individual agreements sufficiently well. It wasn't something that I spent a lot of time looking at. But as you know, there's been a huge proliferation of what they call RTAs, which are bilateral trade agreements, and that's because of the, as I mentioned earlier, slowdown of the Doha round. I think all of those will have investment provisions.
And all of those agreements have more robust provisions on areas outside of the traditional realm of trade than was the case in the past. The recent agreement between Canada and Colombia, the free trade agreement, had the most robust provisions on both labor and environment of any trade agreements Canada has ever signed, and any trade agreement signed between two countries. So there's an evolution towards including more in the trade agreements, and it just strikes me that that's one of the areas the committee could look at, is whether or not, in terms of tax protocols and transparency, that could be an important way to ensure that economic engagements can actually facilitate greater governance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. We have 1 minute for Monsieur Paillet.
1 minute for Mr. Paillet. One question. Yes, I appreciate Ms. Bloch's comments, but I am wary of her thank yous. You said earlier that you're wary of the total amounts that were said lost in tax evasion. I agree with you. If we knew the exact amount, we could recover that money. If we knew, we could. Last question. You talk about political will. You talked about the G20 and such organizations. I mean, it's up to the leadership of the president of the G20. We saw that Mr. Sarkozy assumed a great leadership with regard to fighting tax evasion when others organized parties in fake lakes. Absolutely. I believe that President Sarkozy will probably be exerting great efforts in that regard. As I read today, he and Angela Merkel in Europe will try to resolve those tax and monetary issues within the Union. And so I'm quite impressed by the energy and the imagination put out by Mr. Sarkozy. And when the presidency is held by a Canadian prime minister, well, then their parties are organized and not much more. No, I'm not talking about the Governor General, but in any case, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Payet.
With us here this morning, we appreciate your comments and your responses to our questions and for the very informed discussion. Colleagues, we will suspend for about a minute or two, and then we will return with committee business.
See.
We are not in camera. I'll just indicate we were. No, we're not. Okay. We're in public. We're continuing our discussions with respect to committee business. We have a motion from Mr. Bryson. Just before I go to that, I think I have consent from all the four parties. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, Mr. Page, cannot appear on February the 10th, so I think I have agreement that he will appear on February the 15th, and that he will appear for 1.5 hours, and then we will have the economist for 1.5 hours. So we will have a 3-hour meeting on Tuesday, February the 15th. And on February the 10th, what I would like to do is to have a subcommittee meeting instead at that time. Probably likely only take an hour. So, d'accord? Ça va? Okay, I take that as consent. Thank you all. And now we have a motion by Mr. Bryson, please.
Thank you.
We all have your motion.
Yeah, great. I would just speak briefly to the motion. We all recognize we have a constitutional responsibility as members of Parliament to scrutinize the estimates. And the cost estimates for the justice legislation obviously must have been prepared before the legislation went to Cabinet. Cabinet has made a public decision to support that legislation, but we are denied as legislators the opportunity to determine our support with that information. Now, the cost estimates are not covered by Cabinet confidence because at the end of the day, Parliament, probably the greatest responsibility of Parliament is to scrutinize and oversee the public purse and ensure that tax dollars are spent wisely. Cost estimates are used by each department in ways that are not directly related to Cabinet and as such are not covered under Cabinet confidence. Another example, the projections of corporate profits before taxes and effective corporate income tax rates are used by the department in ways that are not directly related to Cabinet and are not covered by Cabinet confidence. And I have a precedent on this, and only one precedent. There's innumerable precedents on this. But if you go to November 2005, the economic and fiscal update, back the last one during the good old days, but I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, but on page 83 of the economic and fiscal
conservative, I can't
update.
Remember. Were you a conservative good old days? I can't remember.
Order.
I think
Mr. Bryson has the floor.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Chair.
I think we should contact Public Works. There seems to be a loose shingle on the roof or something, Mr. Chair. We have on page 83 of that document, we have in fact a table with quite clearly in that document corporate profits before tax, which is the same figure we're seeking now. And the previous government, before given our sabbatical, felt free to provide that information to the public, felt it was the appropriate measure. In fact, there was not Cabinet confidence. So previous governments provided the exact information that this committee has sought in this case, and that in fact the parliamentary budget officers requested. The government has had 2.5 months to provide to the committee a reasonable response, and it has not done that. And it's time that it go to the Speaker, to the House for its determination. The other we had a further response. We've had some dialogue with Finance Canada on this, and on December 10th we had another response. And again, the Department of Finance said that to the best of its knowledge, the Department of Finance has determined that projections of corporate tax rates before taxes have not been previously disclosed, and as I just demonstrated, in fact, that's not the case. That has been done by previous governments, and I suspect under both progressive conservative governments in the distant past and Liberal governments both felt compelled to provide this information and did not use the foil of Cabinet confidence as a means to deny parliamentarians the opportunity to do our work. So that's that, and my motion, other than that, is self-explanatory.
Thank you. Thank you for that information. I didn't know a sabbatical could be 5 years, but I did learn that today. I have Ms. Glover and then Monsieur Payet.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to just comment briefly on a statement that was made by Mr. Bryson when he said that there are other precedents, a number of other precedents. First of all, I'd like for him to share those precedents with us because, to my knowledge, that page 83 is perhaps the closest, but not at all the same request that's being made, but that is the only one that I could come across. And as I'm new to this committee, perhaps he could enlighten me on others that have been provided, and I'd be glad to look at those. However, what Mr. Bryson is suggesting is that he wants some information that could very easily be provided by the officials. And in discussions with Mr. Bryson's office, we have arranged that the officials could be available Tuesday morning to appear before the committee for half an hour. I think that the most prudent way that we could proceed, and I would suggest this, and perhaps Mr. Bryson could consider it and get back to us. I would suggest that we meet with the officials, we ask them the questions that are relevant, and then at that point proceed with the motion vote, because I think much of this could be cleared up, frankly, if we had the officials, and that, of course, was what was discussed between Mr. Bryson's office and mine. So I would suggest that's the more prudent way to go, and again, I'm going to repeat, page 83 that was referred to is not at all, in my view, what Mr. Bryson is asking for it, and it is the only example that he has provided. So if he has others, I'm happy to hear them.
Okay, I'm going to go to Mr. Payet first, and I'll come back to you. Mr. Payet?
Oui.
I must say, Ms. Glover, that it's all well that you consulted with people from Mr. Bryson's office, but your predecessor also consulted with people from the Bloc and the NDP, and we weren't consulted on this. And I think that next Tuesday we'll have a lot of work on the plate. We have witnesses coming, and I don't think it's a good idea to disrupt our work simply because you've just came to your position. We've had an agenda which has to be respected. Mr. Chair, I agree with you on the duration of a sabbatical. Usually, a sabbatical is held once every 7 years, and I think in their case it'll last 7 years. But we'll see in any case. The Speaker of the House gave a ruling with regard to the Afghan documents that Parliament had priority over the government, which is all fine and well in a democracy. We see in other areas of the world when a government considers it to be over and above Parliament, and we see the results of that. Here, Parliament has a priority over government, and this is a resolution that was passed to obtain all these elements of information. And with the modern communications tools that we have, I don't think it would be impossible to obtain such information. And clearly the government does not want to hand over the information, so it's a lack of political will. And so we are against such ways of doing things, and so we hope that one day, and we'll always maintain this approach, and we do hope that Mr. Bryson will retain the same approach once he comes back into government. But we believe that at this point in time, the motion that is before us, as put forward by Ms. Bryson, is acceptable, and I think we should vote in favor of it without further delay. Thank you.
Mr. Wallace?
I'm fine to hear Mr. Wallace. Okay,
we'll go to Mr. Bryce, or Mr. Wallace, please.
Do not confuse me with Mr. Bryce, please. There you go. Thank you. He's a nice guy, but don't confuse me with him. I'm not crossing any floor.
That's the big distinction. I'm a nice guy.
Yeah,
You
exactly. I know where I stand. Look, I'm prepared to vote against Mr. Bryce's motion. We've made a commitment. The Parliamentary Secretary made a commitment to bring officials here. We've got an answer back, Mr. Chair, that these are confidences, cabinet confidences. That was the response we got based on the motions that were passed. He doesn't like it, doesn't approve it. He was a minister at one time himself. I'm sure there were times where there were things discussed in his cabinet that were confidential. He would not wanted those expressed at committee. We've offered to bring staff here to be able to explain why they're cabinet confidences and what those ramifications would be. They're not interested in that, so I think they're, the the story we hear that they want Parliament to work and work together, but they don't want to hear from what even though they don't like the answers, they don't want to know why those answers are there. So I think we should just vote on this. Our side will likely be voting this down, not supporting his motion, and that'll be the end of the day. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wallace. I have Ms. Hughes, and then I, as the chair, have one question.
Oui, je pense que c'est évident qu'on voit.
Clearly, increasingly, what we're seeing is the government not wanting to show more transparency, to ensure that Canadians know what's going on. I was not consulted either, and I think that Mr. Mulcair wasn't consulted with regard to the government's position or the suggestion to bring forward government representatives here. I find it funny because at one point they only want to hear from ministers before committee. So I guess it's when it suits them best. I can understand that Mr. Bryson crossed the floor because these aren't Conservatives, they're Reform members. I think we have to support the motion. I think Parliament should have its voice heard, and therefore I support the motion. Thank you.
With respect, especially to the justice bills, I mean, to what level of detail are you looking for? Because obviously the costs would differ depending on how many people are actually prosecuted and convicted of these various offenses.
Well, the range of estimates provided by the government, both to ourselves, to the PBO, has been so dramatic that we feel that has not been credible. And we do want, when details, or rather when a macro figure is provided, we want to be provided with details as to the methodology, the methodology that resulted in that figure. And we have not been provided with that, nor has the PBO. And in terms of the issue around consulting with the department, I find it curious in a sense, the idea that department or officials who've been told that this is cabinet confidence are going to now appear before committee to divulge that which they've been told by the political end that is cabinet confidence. And so I share the views of my other colleagues in the bloc and the NDP that this has gone far enough. We can go forward.
I think we'll have the question then. Do you want all in favor of the motion? Okay. All opposed? That's carried. 6-5. This motion is carried. I have no other future business, and we have then set a subcommittee for December the 10th, so unless someone has any other pressing business, we can adjourn the meeting. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.